In this video, we will take a look at some of the reasons why research matters. And along the way, some of the questions we'll answer are: what are research methods? Why should I care about research? And how do we know things to be true? Okay, starting with what are research methods? What does it mean when we refer to research methods? You can pause this video while you think about it or write it down. So, one way to define research methods is tools and approaches for answering questions by collecting and analyzing data and communicating findings. Every research study starts by asking a question. To answer that question, researchers collect and analyze data, and then they always communicate the findings. Because otherwise, what would be the point? It's important to communicate those findings so that they can become applied and to inform researchers who are taking the next steps to dig deeper into that research question. Now, what if you don't plan to do research in your career? Why should you care about research? Well, there are many reasons, but let's take a look at just a few of them. First of all, it's important to realize that research helps professionals address issues in many different careers, including healthcare, education, technology, social policy, just to name a few. And whether that be in your career or your everyday personal information gathering, it's really a key skill to be able to interpret reports and statistics. Further, we are surrounded by all sorts of claims, whether that be in social media or on the news. And whether we choose to adopt that claim and follow its advice or not can have important consequences in our lives. So it really pays to be able to evaluate a claim for its accuracy. Having some background knowledge in research methods is critical for that. For example, when a shampoo says 80% of women saw more shine, having a background in research methods helps you to think to ask, how many women did they test? And how did they measure more shine? It can really help you boost your critical thinking skills. And if you are interested in following a claim, it really pays to verify that claim by confirming the accuracy of the information through reputable resources. And having some background in research methods helps you know where to look. So let's take a step back and ask ourselves, how do we know things to be true? What are some ways of knowing or ways that we have come to hold the beliefs that we have? We're going to take a look at 6 different ways of knowing: tenacity or tradition, intuition, authority, reasoning, empiricism, and science. So, starting with tenacity or tradition, this usually involves a belief we hold because we have heard it often, or perhaps we have known it for a long time. Take, for example, the saying, "A stitch in time saves 9." Or feed a cold, starve a fever. And we know from psychology that repeating an idea can increase the likelihood that people will come to believe it. But it's interesting to consider that some of these sayings that we know so well are actually contradictory. For example, out of sight, out of mind doesn't really go along with absence makes the heart grow fonder. Or what about birds of a feather flock together with opposites attract? And you can also consider how most people believed in the 17th century that the sun orbited the earth. Perhaps one reason why it was so difficult for Galileo to change people's minds is because the sun orbiting the earth is something that they had known or believed all their lives. So, this doesn't mean that knowledge gained through tenacity is wrong or can't be useful. It's just that we can't merely know something is true because it has always believed to be true. What about intuition? Intuition is something we know that comes from within. It's a gut feeling that we have. It tends to be spontaneous and instinctive without any involvement of our senses. It's kind of like sizing up a stranger before they say or do anything. Intuition can be helpful if we have little access to information or a decision needs to be made quickly, but it's not always reliable, and two people using their intuitions can come to different conclusions. For example, a shy person may see an invitation to a party as something scary and to be avoided, while an outgoing person might see that as an opportunity to meet new people and may lead to opportunities. So you could say intuition is subjective and not an objective way of knowing. And then we have authority as a way of knowing. Authority is when we know something because it comes from a source we respect or from an expert. For example, your mom might have told you that if you make a funny face, it will stick permanently. Mom is just one authority. We also have teachers, doctors, religious and political leaders, famous people, social media influencers. And while a source of authority may be right and a good source of information, being an authority doesn't necessarily mean being right. For example, parents can pass on prejudices to their children, or the weatherman may predict rain when it doesn't happen. A doctor could misdiagnose a condition, or consider political leaders that can have opposite views on what is right. And sometimes authority figures may have motivations that are more aligned with businesses and advertisers, or how to win more votes or followers on social media than on what is accurate. Reasoning is a more rigorous way of knowing through applying the rules of reasoning and logic. With reasoning, we start with some basic assumptions, and beliefs are then deduced from those prior assumptions using the rules of logic. For example, we could say, all fruits have seeds. Tomatoes have seeds. Therefore, we can deduce that tomatoes are fruit. Logical reasoning is a very reliable means of generating rational conclusions. However, it still requires confirmation from other evidence. Conclusions based on logical deduction are only as sound as the initial assumptions they are based on. For example, we could say, all dogs have fur. A Mexican hairless is a type of dog. But it would be incorrect to assume that a Mexican hairless dog has fur. While our conclusion is rational, because the initial assumptions are incorrect, the conclusion is also incorrect. And it's also possible to construct logical arguments from both sides of a debate. Take, for example, the issue of immigration into the US. Regardless of which side you support, it's easy to construct logical arguments that lead to differing conclusions. And then we have empiricism. Empiricism is a way of knowing something because we have experienced it through our senses or tools that extend our senses. We can make observations. Knowing through empiricism requires that things are measurable, but that means that way of knowing can be verified by others. Empiricism is a powerful and reliable way of knowing, but it still needs to be combined with other ways of knowing to be useful. One reason is that we can't directly experience everything there is to know. If, for example, just because I haven't visited Antarctica doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or it isn't cold there. And finally, we have science as a way of knowing. Science is arguably the most reliable way of acquiring knowledge. It is an interaction of empiricism and reasoning. It uses empiricism to gather data or evidence, and it uses reasoning to explain the data and to generalize it to other situations. It is also systematic in that it follows a structured, repeatable method that others could also follow. It tends to be a preferred way of knowing because it is the most objective and the least subjective of the ways of knowing. It's the least likely to be affected by personal biases and preconceptions, and it's the most likely to be viewed or understood in the same way by many people. Of course, any way of knowing is subject to some degree of subjectivity, even science, because it is carried out by humans. But it comes closest as a way of knowing based on evidence and tools that everyone can access and use. Some limitations of science, though, are like empiricism, it's limited to domains that can be directly measured. For example, it's difficult to use science to understand questions around consciousness or religion. Further, the tools we have may not be measuring what we think they are, or we may misinterpret the observations. Throughout our course, we will learn about the many limitations of science and what researchers do to minimize them. So, science as a way of knowing is integral to the field of psychology. Psychologists do not simply think intuitively about behavior, cognition, and emotion. They know what they know because they have conducted scientific studies with humans and non human animals, either in their natural environments or in specially designed situations. So let's talk a little bit about science versus pseudoscience. First of all, it's important to emphasize the benefits of science in that it provides evidence that is public and available in the scientific literature. It's subject to reduced bias through many methods that we will get into in this course, but one being its use of systematic methods. And it is based on observable data that can be measured and that others can observe as well. Now, compare that to pseudoscience. What is pseudoscience and why is it different from science? Take a moment to reflect on this, perhaps even writing it down. Go ahead and pause the video while you do this. So, one way to define pseudoscience is claims or beliefs misrepresented as being empirically based, which is another word for saying that it is scientific. And a couple of ways that it differs from true science is that it often relies on other ways of knowing, such as authority and intuition. Authority, in that often it is being communicated through an authority figure who is popular, and it can rely on intuition by relating to ideas that we already know. For example, we often assume that natural treatments must be safer and healthier than manufactured medicines. So, pseudoscientific claims about supplements and medications love to promote that they're all natural. Other pseudoscientific claims might use metaphors that you're familiar with, such as rewiring your brain or detoxing. Pseudoscience is also much more subject to bias than true science, often because pseudoscientific claims are anecdotal, meaning that they're just based off of one person's experience, rather than a systematic method of collecting data. So, coming back to this question, why should I care about research? I have a few more concluding reasons to offer. One is a repeat, and probably one of the most beneficial reasons to the most people, which is having some background in research methods allows you to critically evaluate the credibility of claims in the media. And if you want to be able to verify those claims, it helps to be able to critically evaluate psychological research and its methods and interpretations. Because even though the studies that you will find published in peer reviewed journal articles are held to very high standards, some studies use more reliable and trustworthy methods than others. And it's important to know how to determine if a study's methods are reliable and trustworthy. And this is also a critical skill to have if you do want to go into a career involving research, which is related to my last reason, is that having a background in research methods is the first step in eventually being able to design, conduct, report, and present your own research. So, whether you plan to be a researcher or not, some background knowledge in research methods has a lot to offer you.